Have you ever had the experience of achieving something you had been working toward for long enough that the working toward it had become, in some significant way, the organizing principle of your daily existence? The thing around which the structure of your effort and the direction of your attention and the narrative of your forward motion had been arranged. And then, upon achieving it, feeling not the satisfaction that the achieving was supposed to deliver but something considerably more disorienting. Not the absence of satisfaction exactly, the presence of something else, something that arrived in the specific quiet that follows the completion of a long-pursued goal, in the interval between the achievement and the resumption of pursuit that the achievement was supposed to justify, that felt less like the reward that the effort had been pointed toward and more like the exposure of something that the effort had been pointed away from. The specific, uncomfortable, resistant to easy naming feeling of a person who has arrived at the destination they selected, found it to be a real place with real features, and discovered in the first genuinely quiet moment of actual arrival that the feeling they had expected to find there is not there. That the destination is real, but the satisfaction it was supposed to contain was never in the destination, was never in any destination, was perhaps never available in the form they had been seeking it in, was perhaps not available in any stable, enduring, genuinely satisfying form at all. If that experience is familiar to you, you have touched something that Yuval Noah Harari regards as one of the most important and most consistently avoided truths about the nature of the human mind. Not a truth that requires specialized knowledge or philosophical training to encounter. A truth that most people encounter repeatedly across the full span of their lives in exactly the form you have just described. In the specific gap between the satisfaction that achievement was supposed to deliver and the satisfaction that achievement actually delivers. In the specific, recurring, reliably uncomfortable discovery that the thing that was supposed to make you happy has arrived, and the happiness it was supposed to bring has not arrived with it in the form, or with the durability, or with the completeness that the pursuit of the thing suggested it would. This gap is not a sign of failure. It is not evidence of insufficient effort or insufficient gratitude or the specific forms of psychological malfunction that the self-help industry has built an extensive literature around identifying and correcting. It is evidence of something more fundamental and more structurally significant than any of those explanations suggest. It is evidence of the specific character of the system that generates the felt quality of human experience. A system that was built through millions of years of evolutionary pressure to produce a specific outcome, not happiness, something that happiness, in the forms that most people seek it, is permanently and structurally incapable of providing. The outcome that the system was actually designed to produce is relentless, unresting, forward-leaning, never quite arriving pursuit. The permanent orientation of the organism toward the next thing. The biological machinery of a creature that was never supposed to arrive, because arrival is the enemy of the evolutionary imperative that built the creature in the first place. Harari's most brutal truth, the one that distinguishes his analysis from every comfort-seeking account of human dissatisfaction that the popular culture has produced in abundance, is this: you are not unhappy because you have not yet achieved the right things. You are not unhappy because you have not yet developed the right habits or adopted the right philosophical framework or found the right relationship or accumulated the right combination of experiences and possessions and recognitions that the culture has designated as the components of a genuinely fulfilling life. You are unhappy in the specific recurring way that human beings are unhappy regardless of the external circumstances of their lives, because unhappiness is the system working correctly. Because the biological machinery that generates your subjective experience of your own life was specifically designed by forces that were entirely indifferent to your well-being and entirely oriented toward the single objective of your survival long enough to reproduce, to prevent the arrival of the stable, enduring, genuinely satisfying contentment that you are attempting to achieve. To prevent it not occasionally, not as a side effect of some other process, but as its primary function, as the thing it was built to do. This is Harari's brutal truth. And understanding it genuinely in its full implications rather than in the partial, quickly reassuring form in which it is usually received, is the beginning of the only kind of relationship with the fact of human dissatisfaction that is genuinely adequate to the fact. Not the relationship of someone who has identified another problem to solve, The relationship of someone who has finally understood why the problem cannot be solved in the form that most attempts to solve it take, and what the understanding of this limitation actually makes possible that the misunderstanding of it consistently prevents. To understand the architecture of the system requires going back, as Harari always insists, to the conditions that built it. Not to the conditions of the last century or the last millennium, though the specific forms that human dissatisfaction takes in the contemporary world are shaped by the specific conditions of these most recent eras. To the conditions of the hundreds of thousands of years during which the basic architecture of the human mind was assembled, piece by piece, through the blind, amoral, relentlessly efficient process of natural selection operating on the full range of variation that the genetic lottery produced in each successive generation of the species that was becoming us. The organism that natural selection was building across this span of time was not an organism designed for happiness. It was an organism designed for survival. And the relationship between these two objectives, the objective of the evolutionary process that built the organism and the objective of the organism in its own experience of its own existence, is not one of alignment. It is one of fundamental, structural, and irresolvable tension. Natural selection does not reward organisms that feel good. It rewards organisms that survive long enough to pass their genes to the next generation. And the emotional architecture most effective at producing survival is not the architecture of contentment. It is the architecture of perpetual insufficiency, of the continuous, driving, never fully satisfied sense that something is missing, that something needs to be acquired or secured or defended, that the current situation, whatever its objective character, is not yet adequate to the requirements of the situation that might be coming. This architecture produces, in organisms equipped with it, exactly the motivational orientation that evolution requires. The organism that never feels it has quite enough food will seek more food even when its current supply is adequate, and will therefore be better positioned when the supply decreases. The organism that never feels quite secure will continue to improve its shelter even when its current shelter is sufficient, and will therefore be better positioned when the weather worsens. The organism that never feels quite enough status within its social group will continue to compete for position even when its current position is adequate, and will therefore be better positioned when competition intensifies. The organism that never feels quite satisfied with its current mate will continue to seek opportunities for better reproductive outcomes even when its current arrangements are functional, and will therefore produce more and better adapted offspring. In each of these domains, and across the full range of the adaptive challenges that the ancestral environment presented, the emotional architecture of perpetual insufficiency was more evolutionarily successful than any competing architecture could be. The organism that felt genuinely, durably satisfied would stop striving, would rest in its current sufficiency, would be systematically outcompeted by the organism whose emotional architecture prevented rest in sufficiency and drove continuous striving regardless of objective current conditions. Over hundreds of thousands of years, the striving architecture won. Not because the universe was organized to reward striving, because the striving architecture produced more surviving offspring who inherited the striving architecture, who produced more surviving offspring in the relentless blind accumulation of the evolutionary process that eventually produced a species in which every member carries, in their basic emotional wiring, the legacy of millions of successful strivers who never stopped striving long enough to let the contentment that would have killed their evolutionary prospects actually arrive. This is the wiring that you inherited. This is the system that generates your felt experience of your own life. Not the system that you chose, not the system that serves your conscious objectives, not the system that your most considered and most philosophical understanding of what makes life worth living would have designed if the design had been left to you. The system that your ancestors' ancestors' ancestors inherited from their ancestors, across a chain of inheritance so long and so continuous that the distance between the world that shaped the system and the world that the system is now being required to operate in is, in Harari's analysis, among the most important and most consistently under-examined facts about the human situation. The distance is this. The emotional architecture was calibrated for an environment of genuine scarcity, genuine physical threat, genuine social precarity, and genuine uncertainty about the most basic requirements of survival. It was calibrated for conditions in which the gap between what the organism had and what it needed for survival was real, immediate, and continuously variable. In which the anxiety about insufficiency was an accurate signal about the actual insufficiency that the environment regularly produced. In which the drive for more, for better, for continued improvement of the organism's position in relation to the requirements of its environment corresponded to a genuine ongoing requirement for continued striving because the environment that the striving was required to navigate was genuinely and continuously demanding. The majority of the people reading these words are not living in that environment. They are living in an environment that is, by any objective measure, of the variables that the emotional architecture was calibrated to track, radically different from the environment that produced the calibration. They have, in most cases, access to food in quantities and varieties that would be incomprehensible to the ancestors whose emotional architecture they have inherited. They have shelter, warmth, medical care, access to the accumulated knowledge of the species, and a degree of physical security from the most immediate forms of predation and conflict that the ancestral environment presented that would constitute, by any ancestral standard of assessment, a condition of extraordinary abundance and extraordinary safety. And their emotional architecture does not register this as abundance and safety. It registers it with the relentless accuracy of a system calibrated for conditions that no longer exist, as insufficiency, as the gap between what is currently available and what would be required for genuine security, as the permanent, low-grade anxiety of a creature that was never supposed to feel secure because security was, for the vast majority of the time that the architecture was being assembled, a condition that the environment did not consistently provide, and that the architecture that felt secure was not adequately motivated to maintain. The modern human being sitting in a heated apartment with a full refrigerator and a stable income and a reasonable expectation of continuing to have all of these things for the foreseeable future feels, to a degree that varies among individuals but is never zero, anxious, incomplete, insufficiently prepared for the threats that might be coming, aware of the gap between their current position and the position of others who appear to have more, to be safer, to be better prepared, to be more admired, to be more certain of their continued sufficiency in the domains that the emotional architecture is tracking. This awareness is not a failure of gratitude. It is not a failure of perspective. It is the emotional architecture functioning exactly as it was designed to function, in an environment for which it was not designed, generating the felt quality of insufficiency that was adaptive in its original context and is simply persistent in its new one. This is the first layer of Harari's brutal truth. The wiring that generates human dissatisfaction is not a mistake. It is not a bug in the system that could in principle be fixed. It is the system's most fundamental feature. And the feature was not put there for your benefit. It was put there by a process that was not interested in your benefit. It was put there by evolution, which is interested in nothing and which produced through its amoral efficiency the specific emotional architecture that you inhabit, not because that architecture makes your experience of your own life better, but because it made your ancestors' reproduction more probable. The second layer of Harari's brutal truth concerns the specific mechanisms through which the emotional architecture of insufficiency operates in the contemporary context. Not the broad evolutionary account, but the specific, contemporary, daily experience of what the wiring actually does in the actual conditions of an actual modern life. The specific mechanisms through which the ancient architecture of perpetual insufficiency expresses itself in the specific forms of dissatisfaction, anxiety, comparison, and status-seeking that constitute the primary texture of most people's emotional experience of their own lives, most of the time. The most immediately recognizable of these mechanisms is the one that Harari, following the broader psychological literature, identifies as the hedonic treadmill. the specific dynamic through which the achievement of desired outcomes produces a temporary elevation of felt satisfaction that then decays over a period of days to weeks to months, depending on the magnitude of the achievement and the individual's specific emotional architecture, back toward the baseline level of felt satisfaction that preceded the achievement. The promotion produces happiness for weeks before the new level of responsibility, and the new comparison with those whose positions are still more elevated begins to register on the emotional architecture in ways that are indistinguishable in their felt quality from the dissatisfaction that preceded the promotion. The relationship produces happiness for months before the qualities of the partner that were invisible during the pursuit become available for comparison with the qualities that other potential partners would provide. The house produces happiness for a year before the qualities of the neighborhood, the size of the rooms, the inadequacies of the kitchen that had been invisible against the background of not having a house become available for comparison with the houses of the people the emotional architecture registers as relevant competitors. The treadmill does not have a setting at which running fast enough will carry you to a destination that holds you in place. The treadmill's design does not include a destination. It includes only the motion of striving toward the next thing that the emotional architecture has identified as the one that will finally deliver the stable satisfaction that the motion has been promising. And the delivery, when it arrives, is real. The satisfaction is genuine, and it is temporary in the specific way that the evolutionary purpose of the mechanism requires it to be temporary. Because the mechanism was not designed to deliver stable, enduring contentment. It was designed to keep the organism moving, to prevent the arrival at a position that the organism would choose to remain in rather than to continue striving beyond. The second mechanism is comparison, the continuous, automatic, largely unconscious process through which the emotional architecture assesses the adequacy of the organism's current position not in absolute terms but in relative ones. Not whether what you have is sufficient for your genuine needs in any objective sense of what those genuine needs actually require, but whether what you have is more or less than what the relevant others, the people your emotional architecture has identified as your comparison group, currently have. This mechanism was adaptive in the ancestral environment because the relevant others were genuinely competing with you for the same scarce resources, and knowing your position relative to theirs was genuinely important information for the adaptive management of your competitive behavior. Knowing that you had less food than your neighbor was relevant information if your neighbor's surplus was a resource that you could potentially access. Knowing that you had less status than another member of your group was relevant information for the calibration of your competitive effort. In the contemporary world, this comparison mechanism operates with the same automatic efficiency and the same relentless scope that it was built for, in an environment that has made the scale of the comparison group effectively unlimited. The person in a medieval village compared themselves to the 150 people in their immediate social world. The person in a contemporary city compares themselves through the medium of social networks and mass media, and the continuous stream of information about other people's lives and achievements and possessions that digital connectivity makes continuously available to a comparison group that is effectively global. Every person on the planet who has a public presence is, in principle, available to the emotional architecture as a comparison point. And the emotional architecture, which was built to generate motivation from the awareness of relative inadequacy, generates exactly what it was built to generate in response to the awareness that someone, somewhere, has more, does better, is more admired, is more beautiful, is more successful, is more certain of their position in relation to the resources that the emotional architecture tracks as the ones that matter. The result, at the scale of the contemporary information environment, is an organism in a state of continuous, low-grade activation of the comparison mechanism. Continuous awareness of inadequacy relative to the relevant others, where the relevant others have become, through the expansion of the comparison group to global scale, the most successful, most beautiful, most admired, most abundant members of the entire human population. Against this comparison group, whose members are visible continuously and whose achievements and possessions and relationships are presented through the various mechanisms of social performance that the contemporary media environment rewards in their most favorable possible light, the ordinary adequacy of an ordinary life in ordinary circumstances generates, in the emotional architecture that processes it, not the sense of genuine sufficiency that the objective facts of the situation would support, but the persistent background sense of relative inadequacy that the comparison mechanism was designed to produce. The third mechanism is what Harari calls the adaptation machinery, the specific process through which the emotional architecture adjusts its baseline of assessment in response to changes in the organism's actual circumstances. The process through which what was yesterday experienced as abundance becomes today experienced as the ordinary baseline against which new insufficiencies are assessed. The process through which the house that was an extraordinary improvement over the apartment that preceded it becomes, within months of the move, simply the context within which the inadequacies that the next house would address are newly available for registration. The process through which the income that once felt like genuine security becomes the baseline against which the insecurity of not having the higher income that the next level of aspiration requires is continuously measured. This adaptation mechanism was, in the ancestral environment, functionally important precisely because the baseline needed to be continuously recalibrated in response to genuinely changing circumstances. The organism that retained the felt sense of abundance in circumstances that had objectively changed toward scarcity would be less well motivated to address the scarcity than the organism whose felt sense of abundance adapted rapidly to the new circumstances and registered them as the insufficiency they actually represented. Rapid adaptation of the felt baseline to changes in objective circumstances was adaptive because it kept the organism's motivational system accurately calibrated to the actual character of its actual environment. In an environment of genuine abundance, the same mechanism operates with the same efficiency in the same direction, but toward a different and considerably less adaptive outcome. The organism that achieves an objective improvement in its circumstances and immediately adapts its felt baseline to register the new circumstances as the ordinary context within which new insufficiencies become available is an organism whose felt quality of life does not improve in correspondence with objective improvements in its circumstances. The improvement produces a brief elevation of the felt sense of well-being, which then decays as the adaptation mechanism adjusts the baseline, leaving the organism with the same felt relationship to its circumstances as before the improvement, now extended to a context that is objectively better but subjectively indistinguishable in its felt quality of insufficiency from the context that preceded it. This is the machinery of the hedonic treadmill at its deepest level, not simply the replacement of one desire by another after the satisfaction of each successive desire. The more fundamental process of continuous baseline adaptation that ensures that the satisfaction of desires produces a permanent upward adjustment of the baseline against which new insufficiencies are assessed, such that each objective improvement in the organism's circumstances generates, through the adaptation mechanism, a new and equally felt insufficiency in the new and objectively better context. The treadmill keeps moving not simply because desires replace each other, but because the mechanism of desire itself includes the machinery of baseline adaptation that ensures the permanent felt insufficiency of whatever the organism currently has, regardless of what that is. The fourth mechanism is what might be called the narrative of future arrival. The specific, powerful, and almost universally shared cognitive structure through which the emotional architecture projects the satisfaction that the present moment does not deliver into the future moment when the currently pursued goal will have been achieved. The specific story that the mind tells itself about the relationship between the present insufficiency and the future sufficiency that the present striving is pointed toward. The story in which the satisfaction that is currently unavailable will become available at the specific future moment that the current striving is aimed at. When the promotion comes, when the relationship forms, when the book is finished, when the debt is paid, when the children are grown, when the retirement arrives, when the thing that the striving is currently pointed toward is finally achieved. This narrative serves an important motivational function. It is the story that makes the present insufficiency bearable by locating the satisfaction that would make it unbearable in a specific and achievable future state. Without this narrative, the present insufficiency would be experienced as simply what it is: insufficiency without a promised resolution, persistent without a projected end, the permanent felt inadequacy of the present moment with no future moment designated as the one in which the permanent adequacy that the current inadequacy is measuring itself against will finally arrive. The narrative makes the present bearable, but it does so at a cost that Harari identifies as one of the primary mechanisms of human self-deception: the cost of continuous deferral of the genuine engagement with the present moment that is, in the framework of every serious account of what makes human life genuinely worth living, the only actual arena in which anything that genuinely matters is ever actually occurring. The narrative of future arrival perpetually relocates the satisfaction that the present moment offers in a future moment that, when it arrives, generates a new version of the same narrative pointing toward a further future moment, in the permanent postponement of actual inhabitation of actual experience that constitutes, for many people, the primary texture of their relationship with their own lives. This is the fourth mechanism of the wiring for unhappiness. Not the absence of a specific future state that would genuinely deliver the satisfaction the narrative promises, but the structure of the narrative itself, which is not pointed at a genuine future state of satisfaction, but at the next version of the same narrative, indefinitely extended into a future that is always just beyond the current position, and that the emotional architecture's adaptation mechanism ensures will always feel, when arrived at, exactly as insufficient as the position that preceded it. The fifth mechanism is social anxiety in its deepest evolutionary form, the specific, powerful, and for many people the most consistently distressing expression of the emotional architecture of insufficiency. The anxiety about one's standing in the social group. The continuous assessment, conducted automatically and largely below the threshold of conscious awareness, of the degree to which one is accepted, valued, admired, and secure in one's position within the social hierarchy that the emotional architecture registers as the primary arena of competition relevant to survival and reproduction. This mechanism was, in the ancestral environment, an accurate tracking device for genuinely important information. In a group of 150 people in whose continued acceptance, your survival and your reproductive success were directly dependent, the continuous assessment of your social standing was not a neurotic preoccupation with social approval. It was the functional monitoring of one of the most important variables in your actual survival situation. The person whose social standing dropped below the threshold that guaranteed access to the group's resources and protection was a person in genuine danger. The anxiety about social standing was the appropriate emotional signal for a genuine survival risk. In the contemporary world, the same mechanism operates with the same intensity and the same comprehensiveness, tracking social standing across the effectively unlimited social field that digital connectivity has made continuously accessible in a context where the objective survival implications of social standing are, for most people in developed societies, minimal. The person who loses the approval of their social media audience is not in danger of being excluded from the group resources that ensure their survival. The person who fails to achieve the professional recognition that their peers have achieved is not in danger of the social exclusion that would have been, in the ancestral environment, genuinely life-threatening. But the emotional architecture does not know this. The emotional architecture was not updated when the survival implications of social standing changed. It continues to monitor, with the same accuracy and the same intensity that it evolved for genuinely survival-relevant social information, a social field that has expanded from 150 people to billions, generating the same felt quality of anxiety about social standing that was adaptive for a creature whose survival genuinely depended on its position in a small social group. In an organism whose survival does not depend on this in the same way, but whose emotional architecture has not been revised to reflect the change. The result is an organism in a state of continuous, low-grade social anxiety. continuously monitoring its standing relative to others, continuously assessing the adequacy of its social performance, continuously sensitive to signals of disapproval, exclusion, or inadequacy relative to the comparison others that the emotional architecture has identified as the relevant benchmarks, and continuously generating the felt quality of social insufficiency that the monitoring produces, regardless of the actual character of the social circumstances that the monitoring is being applied to, because the mechanism that generates the felt quality is calibrated for conditions in which social insufficiency was always a genuine risk rather than conditions in which it is, for most people most of the time, a felt risk without a corresponding objective danger. This is the architecture that generates the experience of most human lives. The continuous operation of these 5 mechanisms individually and in interaction with each other across the full span of the waking day, in the backgrounds of attention and awareness within which the conscious activities of living are conducted, producing the persistent background felt quality of insufficiency, comparison, adaptation, narrative deferral, and social anxiety that constitutes the emotional baseline from which most people experience most of their time. Not dramatically, not as acute suffering in most cases and most moments, as the quiet, persistent, largely unexamined texture of an existence that is never quite enough, never quite adequate, never quite the thing it was supposed to be by now, never quite the experience that the pursuit of it was supposed to deliver. Harari's brutal truth about this architecture is not that it is a curse that could be removed if only the right intervention were applied. It is that it is the design, that it is what the mind was built to do, and that the most common responses to the architecture, the attempts to achieve one's way out of it, to accumulate one's way out of it, to optimize one's way out of it, through the various techniques of self-improvement and productivity enhancement and lifestyle design that the contemporary culture provides in such abundance, are responses that do not address the architecture but that the architecture efficiently captures and incorporates into its own continued functioning. Every new self-improvement goal is a new version of the narrative of future arrival. Every new comparison with those who have successfully achieved their self-improvement goals is a new activation of the comparison mechanism. Every successful achievement of a self-improvement goal is a new occasion for the adaptation mechanism to adjust the baseline. The architecture is not threatened by the attempt to achieve one's way out of it. The attempt to achieve one's way out of it is one of the most reliable expressions of the architecture's continued operation. The question that Harari's brutal truth raises is therefore not the question that most responses to the experience of human dissatisfaction attempt to answer. Not how to achieve more, or how to achieve better, or how to achieve in the right direction toward the right goals, with the right habits and the right mindset. The question is something more fundamental. The question of what a different relationship with the architecture itself might look like. What it would mean to understand the wiring clearly enough that the wiring's outputs, the dissatisfaction, the comparison, the adaptation, the narrative deferral, the social anxiety, are received and processed differently than they are by a person who does not understand the wiring and therefore experiences its outputs as accurate information about the actual inadequacy of their actual circumstances rather than as the outputs of an evolutionary mechanism calibrated for conditions that no longer exist. This question is the one that Harari's turned toward contemplative traditions, and specifically toward the Buddhist analysis of the human condition that he has engaged with through his sustained meditation practice, is attempting to answer, and the answer that emerges from this engagement is not a comfortable one. It is not the answer that the self-help tradition provides, which is essentially the answer of better striving. It is not the answer of acceptance in the sense of passive resignation to circumstances. It is something more active and more demanding, and in the full depth of its implications, more genuinely radical than either of these alternatives. The answer is observation, the specific, cultivable, demanding practice of actually observing the wiring's outputs as they occur, rather than automatically and unreflectively enacting them. The practice of noticing the dissatisfaction as it arises, without immediately treating it as accurate information about the objective inadequacy of the current circumstances, and generating the motivated behavior that the mechanism was designed to generate. The practice of noticing the comparison as it activates, without immediately treating its outputs as genuine measures of one's actual worth or the actual adequacy of one's actual situation. The practice of noticing the narrative of future arrival as it constructs itself without immediately investing in it, the quality of belief that makes it the primary framework for the experienced relationship with the present moment. The practice of noticing the social anxiety as it generates its continuous assessment without immediately treating its outputs as accurate signals about the actual severity of the social threat that would have warranted the signal in the ancestral environment. This practice does not eliminate the wiring's outputs. It is not realistic to expect that millions of years of evolutionary architecture can be revised through personal effort, however sustained and however sincere. What the practice does is change the relationship between the outputs and the organism's response to them. It inserts between the output and the automatic behavioral response that the output is designed to generate the specific quality of observational awareness that is the prerequisite for any genuinely different response. The space in which the dissatisfaction can be noticed as a mechanism rather than enacted as an imperative. The space in which the comparison can be seen as an automatic process rather than accepted as a genuine assessment of value. The space in which the narrative of future arrival can be recognized as a story the mind is generating rather than received as an accurate map of the territory of one's actual life. This space, in Harari's framework, is not achieved automatically. It is not achieved through intellectual understanding alone, however clear and however complete that understanding might be. The intellectual understanding of the wiring is necessary but not sufficient. It produces the cognitive recognition that the mechanism exists and that its outputs are not accurate information about objective reality. But the cognitive recognition does not by itself change the quality of the experienced relationship with the outputs. The person who understands intellectually that their social anxiety is an evolutionary mechanism calibrated for ancestral conditions still experiences the social anxiety with the same felt quality of genuine threat that the person who has no understanding of the mechanism experiences. What changes the experienced relationship with the outputs is the specific practice of observation. The practice of actually sitting with the outputs as they occur, in real time, with the quality of direct, non-reactive, genuinely curious attention that contemplative traditions have developed in their various forms as the primary tool for the development of the specific kind of relationship with the mind's own processes that genuine freedom from those processes requires. Not freedom in the sense of their elimination, freedom in the sense of not being automatically determined by them. The specific freedom of the organism that can notice what its wiring is producing and, in the noticing, introduce the possibility of a response that is genuinely chosen rather than automatically generated. This practice is the beginning, in Harari's framework, of the only genuinely honest response to the brutal truth about human wiring. Not the response of denying the wiring, which the evidence does not support and which the experience of anyone who tries does not sustain. Not the response of accepting the wiring as destiny, which is accurate about the wiring but inaccurate about the available relationship with it. The response of genuine engagement with the wiring as what it is. The biological legacy of a process that was